The microphone screeched once with feedback before his voice filled the entire cathedral, smooth and rehearsed, as though he had practiced this exact moment of cruelty in front of a mirror. What would you do if the man standing across from you at the altar, in front of 400 guests, took the microphone from the officiant's hand and laughed, actually laughed, before announcing that he could not marry a woman he called financial dead weight? What would you do if he pointed toward the front pew, toward another woman dripping in diamonds, and told the entire church that the wedding now belonged to her instead? Sophia Adler stood frozen in her white gown, her bouquet trembling slightly in her clasped hands, her face betraying nothing, absolutely nothing, while 380 guests gasped and whispered, and some, unforgivably, even chuckled behind their program. None of them, not the groom, not the mistress glittering in the front row, not a single soul in that cathedral, understood that, in less than 4 minutes, the marching boots of an entire imperial guard would be echoing through those very doors, and the man laughing into that microphone would be on his knees before the night was over. To understand how Sophia Adler ended up standing at that altar, absorbing a public humiliation with a composure that unsettled everyone watching, we have to go back nearly 2 years to a small, sunlit classroom on the 2nd floor of Lindenbrook Elementary School, where a woman calling herself Sophia Adler taught 3rd grade mathematics and spent her afternoons grading homework with a red pen that had been a gift from one of her students. Nobody in that school, not the principal, not her colleagues, not the parents who greeted her warmly at pickup each afternoon, had any idea that the quiet, unassuming teacher grading fractions on a second-hand desk was, in fact, Her Imperial Highness, Princess Sophia von Hallenberg, granddaughter and sole direct heir to Emperor Frederick von Hallenberg, sovereign ruler of one of the last remaining hereditary empires in Europe, a dynasty whose combined assets across banking, shipping, and industrial holdings exceeded the value of several small nations. She had grown up inside marble palaces with 200 rooms, educated by private tutors, shadowed constantly by security details who monitored her every movement. And by the time she turned 27, she had grown suffocated by a life where every person she met already knew exactly how much she was worth before they ever learned her favorite book or her laugh. Her grandfather, the emperor, a formidable man whose chest carried more medals than most museums displayed in a single wing, had reluctantly granted her request to step away from public duties for 18 months, transferring ceremonial responsibilities temporarily to a cousin, while Sophia disappeared into an entirely fabricated identity, complete with forged teaching credentials, a modest rented apartment above a bakery, and a wardrobe purchased entirely from department stores rather than the ateliers that had dressed her since childhood. She wanted desperately to discover whether any man could ever love her without first calculating the political and financial value of her bloodline. It was during this fragile, hopeful chapter of self-discovery that she met Damien Cole, a stockbroker with an easy smile and expensive taste who had wandered into the same coffee shop she frequented every morning before school, striking up a conversation about the book she was reading with a charm so effortless it took her nearly 6 months to notice how calculated it actually was. In those early days, Damien seemed wonderfully humble for a man working in finance, always insisting he was still climbing the ladder, still proving himself at his firm, still years away from the kind of wealth his colleagues flaunted so carelessly. He took her to modest Italian restaurants with checkered tablecloths, brought her flowers from the grocery store because, he claimed, expensive florists felt pretentious, and spent hours listening to her talk about her students, nodding along with what appeared to be genuine interest. He told her, one evening on a park bench overlooking a pond full of sleeping ducks, that he did not care that she came from nothing, that all that mattered to him was her heart, her laughter, the way she saw the good in everyone she met. Sophia, starved for exactly this kind of uncomplicated affection, let herself fall completely, allowing herself to believe, for the first time in her adult life, that she had found someone who wanted her simply because she was Sophia, not because of a crown she had deliberately hidden from the world. But somewhere around the 10-month mark, Damien's ambition began revealing itself in small, telling fragments, his conversations shifting increasingly toward money, toward the clients he desperately wanted to land, toward the investors he needed to impress if he ever hoped to make partner at his firm. It was during this period that Vivienne Kessler entered their lives, introduced to Damien through a mutual business contact as a potential angel investor for a hedge fund he was quietly trying to launch on the side. Vivienne was nearly 15 years older than Sophie, a striking woman with silver blonde hair swept into an immaculate chignon, always draped in Chanel and dripping with diamonds that caught the light with theatrical precision whenever she moved her hands, which she did constantly, as though inviting everyone in the room to admire her jewelry. From their very first meeting at a fundraising dinner, Damien insisted Sophia attend. Vivienne's eyes had swept over Sophia's simple department store dress with an expression of barely concealed disdain, the kind of look that communicated an entire paragraph of judgment without requiring a single spoken word. "So you're the schoolteacher," Vivienne had said that first evening, swirling red wine in a glass so delicate it seemed to defy gravity, her tone carrying that particular brand of condescension reserved exclusively for people wealthy women consider beneath. Meaningful conversation. How charming. I always find it fascinating when men in finance date so far outside their professional circle. It shows such range. The word range had landed with surgical precision, an insult disguised as a compliment, and Sophia had simply smiled, years of diplomatic training allowing her to absorb the blow without visible reaction, though internally she felt something cold settle in her stomach, a warning she chose, for Damien's sake, to ignore. The microaggressions multiplied steadily for the following, growing bolder as Vivienne's financial involvement in Damien's career deepened. At a firm holiday party, Vivienne loudly asked Sophia, in front of a cluster of Damien's colleagues, whether she had ever considered a more ambitious career path, her voice pitched just enough to ensure everyone within earshot understood the insult buried beneath the question. At a dinner celebrating Damien securing a significant new client, Vivienne arrived wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than Sophia's annual teaching salary and made a point of mentioning the exact provenance and value of each individual stone, while Sophia sat quietly, feeling smaller with every syllable. At another gathering, someone left an anonymous note tucked into Sophia's coat pocket reading, "Some women climb, some women simply get left behind." And though Sophia never confirmed who had written it, she suspected, with cold certainty, exactly whose handwriting it likely resembled. Damien, rather than defending her against these escalating cruelties, began asking Sophia to simply tolerate them for the sake of his career. Vivienne's investment could change everything for us, he explained one night, avoiding eye contact as he said it, his voice carrying the particular impatience of a man who had already decided which battles mattered to him and which did not. "Can you just be a little more understanding? She's old-fashioned, she doesn't mean anything by it, and honestly, we need her capital if I'm ever going to make partner." Sophia, still clinging to the hope that the man who once brought her grocery store flowers might eventually grow a spine, agreed each time, swallowing her pride, smiling through condescension that grew sharper and more deliberate with each passing month, telling herself that patience would eventually be rewarded with loyalty. She had no idea, during those long months of quiet endurance, that Damien's late-night meetings with Vivienne had already evolved into something considerably more intimate than a simple business arrangement. The wedding planning proceeded despite the mounting tension, largely because Sophia insisted on paying for everything herself using her modest teaching salary and savings, refusing Damien's occasional half-hearted offers to involve his family's more substantial resource, wanting desperately to prove that their marriage could be built on something real rather than financial convenience. She chose a modest cathedral downtown, hired a photographer who charged reasonable rates, selected flowers from a small local florist rather than the extravagant arrangements Vivienne had not so subtly suggested during one particularly uncomfortable dinner. Looking back, Sophia would later recognize the warning signs she had chosen to ignore. The way Damien's phone calls with Vivienne grew longer and more frequent. The way he began canceling their dinner plans to attend last-minute investor meetings that somehow always seemed to run late into the night. The way his enthusiasm for the wedding itself seemed to visibly diminish the closer the date approached. The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and clear, autumn sunlight streaming through the cathedral's stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the stone floor where guests gathered in their finest clothes. chatting quietly, admiring the modest but elegant decoration Sophia had spent months carefully. She stood in the small preparation room adjacent to the nave, her gown a simple, elegant silhouette without a single visible designer label, her hair styled by a friend rather than an expensive salon, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervous excitement and a persistent, nagging unease she could not fully articulate even to herself. She had no idea that in the front pew, Vivian Kessler sat waiting in a stunning emerald gown, diamonds cascading down her throat, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her lips, as though she alone possessed knowledge of exactly how this ceremony would conclude. The processional music began, and Sophia walked down the aisle alone, having no family present in attendance, a detail she had explained away to Damien months earlier with a vague story about estrangement that concealed the truth of her carefully orchestrated anonymity. She reached the altar, her bouquet of white peonies trembling almost imperceptibly in her hand, and looked up at Damien, searching his face for the warmth she had fallen in love with 2 years earlier. She found something else entirely, a strange, unsettling calculation behind his eyes, a nervous energy that had nothing to do with typical wedding day jitters. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice warm and measured, moving through the traditional opening remarks, while 400 guests settled into respectful silence, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows in soft, colored patterns across the stone floor. It happened during the exchange of vows, right as the officiant turned to Damien and asked him to begin. Instead of speaking his vows, Damien reached out and took the microphone directly from the officiant's startled hand, a strange, theatrical smile spreading across his face as he turned to address the assembled guests rather than his bride. A confused murmur rippled through the guests, exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether this constituted some unconventional but ultimately harmless departure from tradition. Sophia felt her stomach drop, a cold, sinking certainty settling over her as she watched Damien's expression shift into something she had never seen directed at her before, something dismissive and cruel. "I want to say something before we continue," Damien announced, his voice amplified through the cathedral's sound system, carrying easily to every corner of the vast stone space. "Sophia is a wonderful woman. She really is. Kind, patient, everything a schoolteacher should." He paused, letting the word schoolteacher hang in the air with deliberate, humiliating emphasis, as though the profession itself were somehow shameful. "But the truth is, I can't marry someone who brings absolutely nothing to the table financially. I have a career to build. I have investors counting on me. I can't be tied down to financial deadweight." A collective gasp rippled through the cathedral, followed by an uncomfortable disbelief. 400 guests frozen in their pews, unsure whether they were witnessing an elaborate joke or something far more genuinely. Sophia stood perfectly still at the altar, her bouquet clutched tightly in hands that had stopped trembling entirely, replaced instead by an unnatural, glacial stillness that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside her chest. She did not cry, she did not gasp. She simply stood there, absorbing the full weight of the humiliation being broadcast across the entire cathedral, her expression carefully, deliberately blank, the same composed mask she had been trained since childhood to wear during moments of extreme provocation. Damien, apparently emboldened by her silence, which he mistook for shock rather than the controlled calm of someone who had survived far worse humiliations in windowless negotiation rooms with hostile foreign dignitaries, turned and gestured dramatically toward the front pew. "This wedding," he announced, his voice ringing with theatrical triumph, "belongs to someone else now." He extended his hand toward Vivian, who rose gracefully from her seat, her emerald gown catching the light streaming through the stained glass windows, her diamond necklace glittering with obscene brilliance as she made her way toward the altar with the unhurried confidence of a woman who believed herself utterly untouchable. A ripple of scandalized whispers moved through the guests, some pressing hands to their mouths in shock, others, unforgivably, beginning to laugh, a low, cruel murmur of amusement rising from certain corners of the cathedral where Damien's colleagues sat, apparently finding entertainment in the public destruction of a woman they had never bothered getting to know. "Vivienne has believed in my potential since the moment we met," Damien continued, taking her hand as she reached the altar, positioning her beside him in the exact spot where Sophia's future had been standing, only moments earlier. She sees my vision. She has the resources to actually build something with something real, something that isn't just teaching third graders how to add fractions. The cruelty of the comment landed with surgical precision, drawing another wave of scandalized laughter from certain guests, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that whatever entertainment value this spectacle carried had crossed decisively into something genuinely ugly. Vivienne, standing beside Damien now, turned to look at Sophia with an expression of pure, undisguised satisfaction, her diamonds catching the light with theatrical precision as she tilted her chin upward. "I do apologize for the timing, darling," she said, her voice carrying easily through the cathedral's excellent acoustic, dripping with false sympathy that fooled absolutely no one. "But surely you understand. Men like Damien need partners who can actually elevate their circumstances, not hold them back with modest little salary and modest little dreams. I'm sure you'll find someone more suited to your particular station eventually." The word station landed like a slap, delivered with the casual cruelty of a woman who had spent her entire life believing that money conferred not just privilege, but moral superiority. Sophia stood motionless at the altar, absorbing wave after wave of public humiliation, her chin lifted slightly, her spine straight, her expression revealing absolutely nothing of the storm building beneath her composed exterior. She thought, in that suspended, endless moment, of every sacrifice she had made over the past 2 years, every insult swallowed for Damien's career, every moment of anonymity chosen specifically to discover whether love could exist without the complications of her birthright. She thought of her grandfather's warning, delivered the night before she left the palace 18 months earlier, his weathered hand resting heavily on her shoulder as he told her that some people would reveal their true character only when they believed no consequences existed for cruelty. She understood now, standing in that cathedral, absorbing insults from a mistress dripping in diamonds and a fiancé who had just humiliated her in front of 400 witnesses, that today was exactly the day her grandfather had warned her about. Without a single word, without a flicker of visible distress, Sophia reached into the small, beaded clutch she had tucked discreetly into her bouquet, her fingers steady and precise despite the chaos of the moment, and withdrew a slim, unmarked device that resembled an ordinary compact mirror, but concealed a single, embedded signal button beneath its polished surface. She pressed it firmly once, her eyes never leaving Damien's face, watching his triumphant smile begin to falter slightly as he registered, for the first time, the complete absence of fear, devastation in her expression. Somewhere across the ocean, deep within the fortified communications center of the Hollenberg Imperial Palace, an alert system that had remained dormant for 18 months suddenly activated, and a duty officer who had been specifically trained for this exact contingency immediately notified the Emperor's personal security detail, already stationed discreetly within a 10-mile radius of the cathedral, as a standard precaution that Sophia had never bothered mentioning to Damien. For several long seconds, nothing happened, and the cathedral remained suspended in its uncomfortable silence, guests exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether the ceremony had concluded or whether some further humiliation awaited. Then, faintly at first, a new sound began infiltrating the cathedral's heavy stone walls, a rhythmic, mechanical cadence that grew steadily louder. The unmistakable sound of disciplined marching boots striking pavement in perfect unison, accompanied by the low, powerful rumble of heavy vehicle engines approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. Damien's triumphant expression flickered into confusion, his eyes darting toward the cathedral's heavy wooden doors, while Vivienne's manicured hand instinctively tightened around his arm, her earlier confidence visibly cracking at the edges. The massive doors at the rear of the cathedral swung open, theatrical, deliberate force, and sunlight poured through the opening, silhouetting the imposing figures now filling the entrance. Dozens of soldiers in full ceremonial imperial uniform, gold braiding catching the light, rifles held with the precise discipline of men who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of formal procession. They marched down the center aisle in perfect formation, boots striking the stone floor with thunderous, synchronized precision, guests scrambling out of their pews in stunned confusion as the soldiers passed, their expressions caught somewhere between terror and disbelieving fascination. Behind this formidable procession walked a figure whose presence alone seemed to compress the very air within the cathedral. An older man of imposing height and bearing, his chest covered in medals that caught the light with blinding brilliance, his expression carved from granite, utterly devoid of warmth for anyone except the woman standing frozen at the altar. Emperor Frederick von Hallenberg moved down the aisle with the unhurried, absolute authority of a man who had commanded nations for over 4 decades. His presence alone silencing every whispered conversation, every nervous cough, every rustle of fine fabric among the 400 stunned guests now witnessing the true scale of what they had unknowingly stumbled into. Damien stood frozen at the altar, the microphone slipping from his suddenly limp fingers, clattering against the stone floor with a sharp, echoing crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent cathedral. Vivienne's face had drained of all color, her diamonds suddenly seeming garish and small against the overwhelming weight of genuine imperial power now filling the space around her. The emperor climbed the altar steps with measured, deliberate strides, his soldiers forming a protective perimeter around the entire altar area, effectively trapping Damien and Vivienne within a circle they could not escape without physically pushing past armed imperial guards. He reached Sophia, his granite expression softening instantly, transforming into something achingly tender as he cupped her face gently between his weathered hands and pressed a slow, reverent kiss to her forehead, a gesture so intimate and unguarded that it seemed to belong to an entirely different private world than the one currently collapsing around Damien and Vivienne. "My granddaughter," he said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence of the cathedral, deep and resonant with unmistakable authority. "I told you these people would reveal themselves eventually. I am only sorry it took this long." The word granddaughter detonated through the cathedral like an explosion, 400 guests suddenly gasping in unison, the pieces of 18 months of careful deception assembling themselves in real time across their horrified, disbelieving faces. Damien's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the modest schoolteacher he had just publicly humiliated with the granddaughter of an actual reigning emperor now standing before him, flanked by dozens of armed imperial soldiers. Vivienne's earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension that seemed to age her entire face in the span of a few devastating seconds. The emperor turned then, his cold, assessing gaze settling on Vivienne with the particular intensity of a predator who had already decided the fate of his prey long before the confrontation began. "You are Vivienne Kessler," he said, not a question, his tone flat and utterly devoid of angel investor, founder of Kessler Capital Ventures. Vivienne nodded weakly, apparently unable to summon her voice, her diamonds suddenly looking cheap and desperate against her visibly trembling throat. "Kessler Capital Ventures," the emperor continued, extracting a folded document from an inner pocket of his ceremonial jacket with unhurried precision, "is, as of this morning, a wholly owned subsidiary of Hallenberg Industrial Holdings, acquired through a series of shell transactions I initiated the moment my granddaughter's location and situation became known to my intelligence office 14 months ago." The words landed with devastating finality, and Sophia watched with quiet, glacial satisfaction as Vivienne's face transformed through a rapid succession of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, horrified. "Understand, that's impossible," Vivienne whispered, her voice barely audible even in the cathedral's perfect. "My company, my investments, my clients are no longer yours," the emperor interrupted, his voice carrying the absolute, unshakable authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, Hallenberg Industrial Holdings exercised full acquisition rights, effective immediately. Your board has already been notified. Your assets have already been frozen pending transition. You own nothing, Miss Kessler. You have not owned anything of significance for several hours now." Vivienne's knees buckled slightly, one manicured hand reaching out to grip the altar rail for support, her diamonds suddenly seeming to mock her with their continued, indifferent brilliance against skin that had gone pale and clammy with genuine terror. Damien, apparently finally processing the complete, catastrophic scope of what was unfolding, turned desperately toward Sophia, his earlier arrogant confidence completely shattered, replaced by pure, undignified pain. "Sophia, please," he stammered, reaching toward her with a trembling hand that he did not. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who you were. If you had known," Sophia interrupted, her voice cutting through his desperate babbling with a calm, cold precision that silenced him instantly. "You would have treated me exactly the same way you treated Vivienne, with calculated interest based entirely on financial value. The only difference is that I would have known from the very beginning exactly what kind of man you truly are." She turned then, addressing her grandfather with quiet, measured composure, though the soldiers standing at attention around them could see the faint, satisfied tightening at the corners of her mouth. "Grandfather," she said, "I believe we've concluded our business here." The emperor nodded once, extending his arm toward her, which she accepted gracefully, her white gown catching the light streaming through the stained glass windows as she prepared to descend the altar steps beside him. Behind them, Damien and Vivienne, having lost absolutely everything in the span of a few devastating minutes, sank to their knees on the altar's marble platform, not in supplication, but in the boneless collapse of people whose entire world had just been dismantled in front of an audience of 400 stunned witnesses. "Please," Damien called out, his voice cracking with desperate, undignified panic. "Sophia, please, I love you. I made a mistake. Please give me another chance." Sophia paused at the top of the altar steps, turning back to look at him one final time, her expression carrying no anger, no lingering hurt, only a vast, quiet emptiness where affection for him used to exist. "You didn't make a mistake, Damien," she said, her voice calm and devastatingly clear, carrying easily through the silent cathedral. "You revealed exactly who you always were. I simply wasn't paying close enough attention until today. Consider this the only gift I have left to give you, the truth, delivered clearly, so you never again mistake cowardice for strategy." She turned away from him completely then, walking down the aisle beside her grandfather, flanked by dozens of soldiers whose disciplined formation parted respectfully around them as they moved toward the cathedral's grand entrance and the fleet of armored vehicles beyond it. Outside, the autumn sunlight illuminated a procession of gleaming black vehicles bearing the imperial crest, engines idling in perfect formation along the cathedral's front drive, dozens of additional soldiers standing at rigid attention beside them. Sophia paused at the top of the cathedral steps, taking a final, deliberate breath of crisp autumn air, feeling the enormous weight of 18 months of careful deception finally lift from her shoulders entirely. She thought of every insult absorbed, every dismissive comment endured, every quiet humiliation swallowed for the sake of a relationship built on nothing but Damien's calculated ambition and Vivienne's casual cruelty, and she felt, for the first time in months, an overwhelming sense of clarity and peace. The following days unfolded with the swift, merciless efficiency that only genuine sovereign power could provide. Kessler Capital Ventures, along with all its subsidiary holdings and client relationships, was formally dissolved within 72 hours, its assets absorbed entirely into Hollenberg Industrial Holdings, while Vivienne herself found every door in the financial world she had once dominated closing simultaneously, her reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. Once word spread through elite circles that she had attempted to seduce away the fiancé of an actual reigning emperor granddaughter. Damien's employment at his firm was terminated within the week, his name becoming a cautionary legend whispered among junior brokers about the catastrophic consequences of underestimating exactly who might be sitting across from you at any given moment. Neither of them ever recovered their previous social standing, both disappearing eventually into obscurity far more permanent and unforgiving than the temporary anonymity Sophia had voluntarily chosen for herself. Sophia returned to the Hollenberg Palace within the month, resuming her full imperial responsibilities with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity that had been noticeably absent before her extended period of disguise. She'd gone searching for love, uncomplicated by her birthright, and had instead discovered something far more valuable, an unshakable certainty regarding her own worth, forged not within palace walls, but standing at an altar, absorbing public humiliation with a composure that had ultimately proven more powerful than any crown. Months later, Addressing a gathering of young diplomats during a formal state function, she was asked whether she regretted her painful experiment with anonymous life among ordinary citizens. She considered the question thoughtfully, then answered with the same quiet, unshakable calm that had once stood perfectly still while an entire cathedral watched her humiliation unfold. I learned that true character reveals itself most honestly in moments when people believe no consequences will follow their cruelty, she said. Damien and Vivienne believed a schoolteacher could be discarded without cost because they assumed power always announces itself loudly before entering a room. True power doesn't need to shout to be respected. It only needs to remember patiently until the precise moment arrives to remind everyone exactly what they underestimate. And so, dear viewer, that is how an emperor's granddaughter disguised as a humble schoolteacher walked into a cathedral facing public humiliation and walked out having erased her enemy's entire fortune in a single afternoon, leaving behind a disgraced mistress, a groveling, and 400 witnesses who learned far too late that the quietest woman is sometimes the one whose family commands an actual empire. What did you think of this masterful revenge? Did Damien and Vivienne get exactly what they deserved? If you loved watching arrogant elites lose absolutely everything in a single devastating afternoon, smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of karma, justice, and quiet imperial power finally reclaiming what was always rightfully hers.